Thank you for attending this virtual presentation. The aim of this talk is to explain the transformation of the Cittern inside and outside the Italian peninsula and to understand the cultural factors that catalyze this process. The Cittern, developed around the early 16th century, is a wire-strung, plucked musical instrument with a teardrop shape, shallow resonator, and a flat back. One particular characteristic of the Cittern is that the neck is narrower than the fretboard, which leaves a thumb rest that eases the playing technique. Citterns have metal frets inserted on the fingerboard and are placed next to a hard wooden wedge, which is fitted on a carved slot. A remarkable characteristic of the Cittern's sound is its reentrant tuning, which consists in a non-successive disposition of rising and falling intervals. The cetra and the citole are important instruments for the Cittern's heritage. The cetra and the citole have been treated as the same instruments. However, research suggests that they were different. The citole is a short-necked plucked string with different resonator shapes, such as holy leaf, hexagonal, guitar or fiddle-like shape, and could have been strung either with wire or gut. This instrument, which sometimes is also presented with shoulder and trefoil extension, was used from the 13th to the 15th century, and it was particularly popular in northern France, the Iberian Kingdom of Castile and Leon, and England. The cetra, also spelled in medieval Italian cetera, is a short-necked wire pluck string with spatulate or oval resonator, hook on the back of the peghead, with end projections also called wings or horns, and block frets. This instrument is only found in iconography coming from the Italian peninsula, which dates from the 12th to the first half of the 16th century. The citole and the cetra are connected, for they shared some similarities in their morphology. Nevertheless, the nature of their connection is not clear. Since the cetra is older, the citole could be considered as a variant of this Italian fretted pluck string. As Crawford Young has suggested in his doctoral dissertation, the cetra was used as a Christianized version of the lyre in 13th century Franciscan traditions and late 15th century humanist practices. Hence, the oval shape and shoulder extensions were reminiscent of the contour of an idealized shape of a lyre, where the wooden extensions acted as icons of the horns that, according to Greek mythology, Hermes inserted in the tortoise shell resonator. The tapering body, also called vortex construction, was probably meant to symbolize the tortoise resonator of the Homeric hymns. The protruding string holder was meant to symbolize an idealized lyre stand. The hook on the peghead could have been some sort of support to play the cetra in an upright fashion, assimilating the playing of a lyre. And perhaps, as Young has proposed, the hook could have been some sort of iconological element of the inner sections of the kithara. Emanuel Winternitz proposed that the ancient Greek lyre was gradually transformed into the cetra, and later arriving to the Cittern. This theory is grounded on assuming that non-functional features, specifically the shoulder extensions, hook, and expanded string holder, remain as iconological and decorative elements which reveal its evolution. Winternitz's theory, although possible, requires more evidence, considering the large scope of time, which ranges from late antiquity to the 15th century. Moreover, the morphological features that show this ancestry could have been a creative product of instrument makers, and not necessarily a hidden underground stream of tradition. Still, we can say that the cultivation of the lyre was certainly manifested as a fundamental iconological aspect of the cetra, which was later passed on to the Cittern. The theory of conceiving the block-fretted cetra as the direct forerunner of the Cittern has been proposed and accepted, although it has not been fully developed. What is the difference between the Cetra and the Cittern? From a historical point of view, there is no difference between them. Both names, Cetra and Cetera, have been used for the Cittern inside of the Italian peninsula. All we can say is that the Cetra underwent significant changes between the 1500s and 1530 inside the Italian peninsula. The shoulder extensions, protruding string holder, and the hook were all reduced in size. The block frets changed into a solid fingerboard. The neck length, in some cases, was increased, as well as the tuning and the number of strings. The significance of the symbolism gave way to practicality, as Winternitz told us. Here we can see the dramatic difference between the two types of horns. In the left-hand side image, we see a larger size of horns, while in Giulio Campagnola depiction, we can see how these horns are close to be the typical Cittern scrolls. Note also the difference in size between the shoulder extensions, which eventually were changed into the Cittern scrolls, like we see in the right-hand image. The tapering body, also called vortex construction, is another technical feature that indicates that the Cittern was developed out of the Cetra. The tapering body, virtually present in all Italian traditional Citterns, is a characteristic of the monoxylic construction, for throughout its carving technique it's possible to obtain a gradual decrease in size of the contour, which is larger on the soundboard and smaller in the bottom board. Similarly, the height of the wall is larger on the heel of the instrument than near the comb or the string holder, which is another recurrent characteristic of the Cittern as well as in the Cetra. The string holder, present in virtually all traditional Italian Citterns, was kept much longer than the horns, for it was a practical feature that provided monoxylic instruments with a strong string holder, which was part of the same resonator. String holders can be seen in historical Citterns, which show how this piece considerably decreased in size when compared to the aforementioned iconographical examples. It is likely that the string holder was eliminated from Cittern crafting due to the apparent instability when stressed by the metal string. The Cetra frets, or wooden blocks, which are placed on the neck of the instrument, eventually were joined together into a solid fingerboard. Another Cetra with reduced block frets can be appreciated in these images. Here we can see how eventually the block frets were transformed into wooden wedges that hold the frets in place. Also, we can see the distinctive way of joining the block frets and fingerboard into the neck of the instrument, a feature that is constant in all historical Citterns. The Cetra's building technique is evident in the historical Cittern signed by Raffaello da Urbino. It is possible to see how the Cittern was carved from the same piece of wood, which left a narrow neck, which was served as the base for the fingerboard. It is not clear exactly when the Cetra was provided with a full solid fingerboard and metal frets. The 1526 Girolamo dai Libri instrument is one of the earliest visual evidences of the use of partial fretting, and well could be the earliest Cittern ever depicted in Italian iconography. Also, this image allows us to see the method of inserting the tuning pegs. This satellite fashion is common in all traditional Italian Citterns. Moreover, the existence of early Citterns with peculiar contour shapes is attested by the similarities found on the instrument signed by Raffaello da Urbino and the Girolamo dai Libri Cetra, or Cittern. Another feature that connects the Cetra and the Cittern is the fingerboard cutaway, located at the lower end of the piece of the soundboard, which indicates how the bass and metal strings were not played so often as the treble. This constitutes a typical feature present in several historical Citterns, as we can see in this image. For example, the circa 1520 Cetra depiction by Fra Giovanni da Verona show how the block frets decrease in length as the pieces approach the body of the instrument, which automatically leaves the space for what later was going to be a cutaway. Some makers took advantage of the space provided by the fingerboard cutaway and then created beautiful carvings, such as the one depicted in this image. Tintori's Cetra tuning was expanded into the Italian Citterns of the 16th and 17th centuries. In his 1478 De Inventione et Uso Musicae, the Franco-Flemish theorist described the block fret Cetra. However, he called it cetula, exposing the connection between the word citol and Cetra. Although Tintori's instructions are somewhat confusing, scholars agree on a tuning that is related to the Cittern. We can see how this disposition was followed in a great number of tablatures in the following century. Tintori's tuning is connected with the disposition described by music theorist from Parma Giovanni Maria Lanfranco. In his Scintille di Musica of 1533, he gave the instructions for an early six-string cetara with a major hexachord. Lanfranco's first four courses follow a very similar interval as Tintori's, which could have been changed into a hexachord disposition. The cetara explanation of Scintille di Musica was practically copied by Cerone in his treatise published in 1613 and entitled El Melopeo y Maestro, Tratado de Música Teórica y Práctica. Cerone referred to the Cittern as citola and cítara, which were the Spanish names of the Cittern. The link between the theorist and the 17th century Cittern is well attested by Praetorius, Mersenne, and Kircher. These theorists used the same intervals as Lanfranco and Cerone. In this case, they used specific pitches, which were described by Praetorius as the Old Italian tuning, which suggests that this disposition belongs to what he called the Italians of former times, which can also indicate that this hexachord disposition was once the tuning of the Cetra. There is no evidence of the Cittern outside of the Italian peninsula before 1534. For example, neither Sebastian Birdung or Martin Agricola, who modeled his work on Birdung's, include any reference to the instrument. The oldest, most direct evidence is a Germanic source, a depiction of a Cittern that can be found in Nuremberg. Note the partial frets, how the cutaway is still present on the fingerboard, yet the tapering body has disappeared and probably was transformed into a built-in technique, separated pieces joined together. Also note that the number of strings has decreased. This is not visual on this image, but we can see the tuning pegs that have been decreased in number. Another important distinction is the peg box, instead of a peg head, as in the Italian Citterns. These are the basic characteristics of the Citterns built outside of the Italian peninsula, of what I like to call the Transalpine Cittern. How was the Italian Cetra transformed in a city like Nuremberg? There are reasons to believe that the emergence of the Transalpine Cittern happened mainly because of the rise of instrumental music and its use as a social tool for the nobility and the rising upper middle class. The hall where the depiction is found was commissioned by Lienhard III. He was part of a noble family who built up a significant trade in business, specializing in trading goods on an international scale. Nuremberg was a major center of science, trading, and crafts. The merchants had freedom to apply their trade without worrying about guilds. The city had entrepreneurs that innovated markets and productions. The purpose of the hall where the Cittern is depicted was leisure and social occasions. Built by Peter Fludna, a Nuremberg sculptor, who introduced much of his Italian influences into the city, and he possibly traveled to Italy in 1520. This leisure functionality had a social purpose. By the turn of the 15th century, there was a considerable dissemination of instrumental practice and collection of musical instruments that was rooted in the culture of the Italian peninsula. Musical instruments were an inevitable necessity for elite homes. Il Cortegiano, or the Book of the Courtier, written by Baldassare Castiglione, was the most popular manual for anyone that aspired a courtly life. For an amateur player, producing clear-toned notes and chords, which will potentially be helpful in harmonizing the voice, is easier to do on fretted string instruments than on fretless bowed strings. Therefore, it is not a surprise to find in Il Cortegiano a preference for the instrument da tasti, which is a term that could be either used for keyboards or fretted instruments. Therefore, the fixed frets or fixed tones of the cetra must have been well appreciated by the amateur player, not to mention the bright wire strings, which could provide a rich chordal and loud support for the voice. Il Cortegiano was immensely popular all across the European continent, and soon many courts and rising upper-middle-class homes were influenced by Castiglione's approach to courtly life. Instruments were no longer grouped by the common prior classification of loud and soft, but started to develop an idiom, a voice of its own. Ensembles rose within these changes, which transformed the common madrigal, mass, motet, and chanson into an explosion of different textures, imitating, supporting, and varying each other at the same time. The popularity of the polyphonic instrumental music led the way for the search of idiomatic textures, which further transformed the existing string instruments. These factors come into play for our understanding of the Cittern, for the particular characteristics provided by the wire strings, the reentrant tuning, and plectrum technique were in itself a new idiom for the rising instrumental ensembles. So far, there are still many questions to be asked. The cetra and the Cittern were rooted in a medieval and Renaissance humanist autochthonous cultural expression that provided a tangible musical connection with antiquity. Were these centuries of cultural syncretism all abruptly changed and made into an object of leisure? Is this stage of the Cittern's history an example of cultural appropriation? Is this the product of the early European capitalism, which was characterized for decontextualizing art and tradition for the purpose of leisure through social mobility, as well as profit? This is not black and white, only gray, for the Cittern at this moment was out of the Italian peninsula and its journey through Europe was only beginning. Soon the Cittern will become a very popular instrument for the Low Countries and England, who will use it once again to recreate their musical culture and social identity. Thank you very much for your attention.